The relationship between the United States and Cuba has been defined by a paradox of proximity and distance. Mere miles apart geographically, yet light years apart ideologically. While the U.S. has historically intervened in nations across the globe to secure its interests, it has notably refrained from a direct, full-scale military invasion of Cuba since the botched Bay of Pigs operation in 1961. This hesitation is not born out of benevolence, but rather a cold calculation of risk. The United States is cautious because Cuba represents a unique geopolitical porcupine. A target that, while small, possesses offenses and strategic consequences painful enough to make any aggression prohibitively costly. To understand this caution, one must first acknowledge that the United States did make moves on Cuba in the past, establishing a pattern of dominance that eventually backfired. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, the U.S. military occupied the island, not to annex it, but to mold it into a compliant client state. Through the Platt Amendment, the U.S. legalized its right to intervene in Cuban affairs, which it did repeatedly in the early 20th century. These early interventions were police actions designed to protect American business interests, creating a resentment that fueled the very revolution the U.S. would later come to fear. The turning point for American military caution was the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The CIA attempted to replicate its success in Guatemala 1954 by using proxy forces, Cuban exiles, to overthrow Fidel Castro, assuming the local population would rise up to join them. Instead, the population rallied around the regime, and the invasion force was crushed. This failure taught the Pentagon a critical lesson. The Cuban government commanded genuine, entrenched loyalty among a significant portion of its populace and military, meaning any future invasion would require hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops, not just a covert operation. This caution was solidified into international law and superpower dogma during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When the world stood on the brink of nuclear annihilation, the resolution between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev contained a secret but binding component. In exchange for the Soviet Union removing nuclear missiles from the island, the United States pledged never to invade Cuba. While the Soviet Union is gone, this diplomatic ghost remains. Breaking such a long-standing pledge would have historically signaled to other adversaries that U.S. security guarantees were worthless, destabilizing global diplomacy. Beyond treaties, the United States is scared of the specific military doctrine Cuba adopted in response to the American threat: the war of all the people. Unlike Iraq or Panama, where the U.S. faced conventional armies that could be destroyed in open battle, Cuba tailored its defense entirely around asymmetric warfare. The doctrine dictates that in the event of an invasion, the conventional army dissolves into the population to fight a protracted guerrilla war. Every neighborhood, factory, and farm is organized into defensive zones, turning the entire island into a hostile environment where there is no clear front line. This prospect creates a nightmare scenario for U.S. military planners known as an urban meat grinder. Havana is a dense, sprawling city with narrow streets and fortified concrete infrastructure. Fighting through such terrain is the most difficult and casualty-heavy form of warfare, as seen in battles like Fallujah or Mosul. The U.S. military estimates that occupying Cuba would require a massive, long-term troop presence to suppress an insurgency that has been preparing for exactly this scenario for 60 years. The potential loss of American life would be politically unsustainable. What Cuba has that the U.S. fears is not high-tech weaponry, but a sophisticated and deeply embedded intelligence network. The Cuban Intelligence Service, the G2, is widely considered one of the best in the world, often punching far above its weight. They have historically infiltrated the U.S. government, the CIA, and anti-Castro exile groups with startling efficiency. This intelligence capability denies the U.S. the element of surprise, ensuring that Havana would know about an invasion plan before the first ship left a Florida port. Furthermore, Cuba possesses a biological weapon of a different sort: migration. The Cuban government has effectively weaponized its own population as a deterrent against U.S. aggression. During periods of high tension, such as the Mariel boat lift in 1980 or the Balsero crisis in 1994, Havana simply opened its borders, flooding Florida with tens of thousands of refugees. A U.S. invasion would almost certainly trigger a mass exodus of millions of Cubans, creating a humanitarian and economic crisis in the southeastern United States that would overwhelm federal resources and cripple the local economy. Geopolitically, the United States also fears the diplomatic fallout of an invasion. For decades, the U.S. embargo against Cuba has been almost universally condemned by the United Nations. A military invasion would be viewed by Latin America not as a liberation, but as a return to 19th-century imperialism. It would likely shatter U.S. relations with key regional partners like Mexico and Brazil, destroying the fragile diplomatic architecture of the Western Hemisphere and potentially driving these nations closer to American rivals like China. Speaking of rivals, Cuba's value to U.S. adversaries acts as another layer of protection. During the Cold War, it was the Soviets. Today, Russia and China maintain close ties with Havana. While they may not start World War III to save Cuba, they use the island as a critical listening post and signals intelligence hub to spy on the United States. An invasion would risk escalating tensions with these nuclear-armed powers, who view Cuba as a strategic foothold in America's backyard, much as the U.S. views Taiwan or Ukraine. Economically, there's also the loot factor, or rather, the lack of it. Unlike the invasion of Iraq, which was underpinned by the strategic value of oil, or interventions in places with rare earth minerals, Cuba offers little in the way of extractable resources to offset the cost of war. The island's economy is sugar, tobacco, tourism, and nickel. The cost of a military campaign and subsequent nation-building would run into the trillions of dollars, with absolutely no return on investment for the U.S. Treasury. The domestic political landscape in the United States also contributes to this hesitation. For decades, the powerful Cuban-American lobby in Florida advocated for a hardline stance, but curiously, this rarely translated into calls for direct U.S. military invasion. The exile community understands that an invasion would destroy the very island they hope to reclaim and likely kill their relatives remaining there. The political goal has always been to strangle the regime economically so it collapses from within, rather than flattening it with bombs. Additionally, the United States already possesses the strategic asset it would theoretically invade to secure: a military base. The U.S. naval station at Guantanamo Bay is a bizarre geopolitical anomaly. A U.S. base on the soil of a hostile nation. Because the U.S. already controls this deep-water port and detention center, it gains the strategic advantage of a Caribbean foothold without the burden of governing the surrounding hostile population. Invading the rest of the island would add liabilities without adding significant strategic assets. There is also the fear of the morning after. If the U.S. were to invade and successfully topple the communist government, it would instantly become responsible for a nation of 11 million people with crumbling infrastructure and a socialist economy incompatible with global markets. The U.S. would inherit a failed state 90 miles from its border. The chaos of a post-invasion power vacuum could foster drug cartels, organized crime, and terrorism, replacing a stable, albeit hostile, government with an uncontrollable zone of anarchy. Cuba's medical diplomacy also provides a strange form of soft power armor. The country exports doctors and medical aid to developing nations worldwide, generating significant international goodwill. An American invasion would not just be attacking a dictatorship, it would be attacking a nation seen by much of the global South as a provider of healthcare and education. The propaganda victory for anti-American sentiment globally would be catastrophic, portraying the U.S. as a bully destroying a small, humanitarian-focused nation. Another factor is the sheer inertia of the stalemate. The status quo, while imperfect, is predictable. The Cuban government effectively polices its own coastline, largely preventing drug trafficking and uncontrolled migration when relations are stable. The Pentagon prefers a devil they know to the unpredictable chaos of regime change. The Cuban military and security forces are disciplined and maintain order. Destroying them would remove the only force capable of policing the Florida Straits from the southern side. Finally, the modern nature of warfare has shifted away from boots-on-the-ground invasions. The United States has realized that cyber warfare Economic sanctions and cultural influence are far more effective tools for regime change than tanks.